quaint old town with 100-year-old buildings and probably one of the youngest being about 60 years, there also comes a threat with that with lead pipes, lead faucets, and other types of lead in our drinking water. We want to make sure that our children have a safe and healthy environment to grow up in.
When I think of a lead-safe community, I think of a place where your home is your safe space, which is what it's supposed to be. I envision a place where people can have their young children be there without worrying about the damages that are being caused to them. I think about a place where children can go to school and can go to daycare and not have to even think about invisible contaminants that they can do nothing about.
A lead-safe community for me as a contractor, since we know that the buildings in Pittsburgh are old, is one where contractors are trained to make lead-safe renovations so that parents can buy homes knowing that their children will be contaminated.
Reaching out to community leaders, the legislation, voting is the big key, because without that, there's no change is not going to happen. We got to speak up.
It means that one day I'll be able to talk about lead exposure and lead poisoning in the past tense instead of the present.
A lead-safe community to me means we do not have to worry about our children's health, that they will be healthy, they will be able to learn when they go to school, and nothing will affect their minds that's coming from our water faucets.
I think a lead-safe community is one where families, and especially vulnerable families, can live a safe, high quality of life. One where they're not fearful of contaminations in their water, in their soil, and one where there's lots of information and knowledge about what to do if there is a problem.
A lead-safe community values science, precaution, and makes investments in risk reduction. And if kids are exposed to lead, a lead-safe community makes sure that those families have all the resources they need to eliminate lead hazards and proactively address the impacts of lead poisoning on their children's lives.
Lead essentially contributes to the way we learn, the way we grow, our healthcare status, the food that we eat, the air that we breathe. So creating a lead-free system, a lead-free community will overall create a healthy living environment for not only adults but children as well.
It means that all of the government agencies, municipal leaders, nonprofits and social service agencies, as well as the healthcare practitioners, are working collaboratively and collectively to implement these primary prevention strategies that we know work. We have the solutions, and now it's time for all of us to work together to make a difference.
Good morning, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to Life Without Lead, envisioning a lead-safe community for all. I am Michelle Nakaradi-Chapkus, Executive Director at Women for a Healthy Environment and Chair of the Lead-Safe Allegheny Coalition. Our coalition's vision is clear. We strive for a community in which all Allegheny County children and their families live in a lead-safe environment. As you may know, this is National Lead Poisoning Prevention Week. Each year, this week is a call to bring individuals, organizations, industry, state, tribal, and local governments together to increase lead poisoning prevention awareness in an effort to reduce childhood exposure to lead. It is an opportunity to highlight the significance of this public health threat and develop strategies to prevent its serious health effects. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, our EPA, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and its many partners, including many of you who are joining us virtually today, work to heighten awareness of lead poisoning, provide critical resources, and develop and advocate for preventative actions during this week and beyond. Hosting today's summit was a collective effort of the Lead Safe Allegheny Coalition, and I want to also thank our partners at Blender. The objectives of the coalition's 4 committees are centered around its mission to provide leadership and advocacy that advances these strategic initiatives and fosters collaboration among the community by focusing on these primary prevention resources and opportunities, what the policies are to advance these health protective measures. And ultimately, as you heard, to create a lead-safe environment. Lead poisoning affects all of us, and we all need to take responsibility for addressing it. Whether in our housing, water, or soil, we must act collectively to prevent and remediate lead hazards and the harmful effects of its exposure on affected children and families. Dedicated resources are needed for lead testing in homes, lead hazard control and abatement, assistance for affected families, community education and organizing, workforce development for lead professionals, increasing the supply of safe, affordable housing options, training in lead-safe work practices for property owners, contractors, and more. These will be topics of many conversations that you hear throughout the day. It is our goal that this summit will further that vision of creating healthier environments for our residents, especially those who live in environmental justice communities. For health equity is front and center of all conversations today. As you may have heard, the report provided by the state's Department of Health last year informed us that Black and brown children in Allegheny County have 6 times the rate of lead poisoning as their white counterparts. Today, we say no more. We put plans into action to address these all too often recognized health disparities. It is a call to action for community leaders and elected officials. Not only do we need them to be caring and committed in this space, we need them to step up, step forward, and be bold about what is best to protect our children. We need them to advance policies that are truly health protective, rather than taking the path of least resistance. That's the health in all policies approach, and the one that we all ascribe to today. Now, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Phil Johnson, our friend and colleague, and Senior Program Director for Environment and Health at the Heinz Endowments, who has generously sponsored today's program. Phil?
Thanks, Michelle, and good morning. The Heinz Endowments is pleased to sponsor today's summit, Envisioning a Lead-Safe Community for All, as we seek to help our region thrive as a whole and just community, and through that, work to model solutions to major national and global challenges. Today, we come together to focus on a solutions-based approach to a decades-old problem, children's lead exposure. Thanks to the courage and hard work of many who have come before us, tremendous progress has been made in removing lead from our environment. But there's still more work to do. As you know, lead is toxic to humans. It is a highly poisonous metal that can affect almost every organ and system in the human body. Lead can cross the blood-brain barrier, attack nerve cells, and interfere with neurochemical development. As we also know, for centuries, humans have prized lead for its utility. Soft, highly malleable, with a low melting point, lead has been called the miracle metal, used in gasoline, glass, cookware, paint, plumbing, and many other technological applications. Over time, this metal became ubiquitous in our environment. And this is the legacy we are grappling with today, especially in our built environment, the very places where we live and the systems that support our existence. The real-world public health implications of this ancient metal are profound. Science informs us there is no safe level of lead exposure. Even at low doses, lead could have devastating impacts to health and learning with lifelong consequences, especially to our infants and children. And we know that children's lead exposure continues at unacceptable levels, often in our most intimate environments, places where harm should never be allowed. Fortunately, there are solutions, proven and successful interventions that can be done right now. In fact, there are cities and regions that have worked hard to successfully reduce the burden of lead poisoning on their children. These places have implemented strategies, so-called primary prevention strategies, that can actually eliminate lead exposures from happening. There is simply no excuse that a modern society today can continue to allow childhood lead exposures to continue. And yet, we are having this summit because our society has not yet eliminated lead exposures. We haven't yet summoned the means and the resources to get the job done. Today is a day to hear from advocates focused on addressing lead in environmental justice communities. to learn from experts who will share policies for city and government and county governments to follow. We need committed agency and elected leaders who aren't afraid to make bold statements and to put into motion strategies to address the threat of lead poisoning within their jurisdictions. Ultimately, it's our job to work together to create a healthy and sustainable community for all, especially for our children. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you LaTricea Adams. Ms. Adams is a proud native of Memphis, Tennessee, and is the founder, CEO, and president of Black Millennials for Flint, a national grassroots environmental justice and civil rights organization with the purpose of bringing like-minded organizations together to take action and advocate against the crisis of lead exposure, specifically in African American and Latinx communities throughout the nation. She is the youngest African American woman appointed to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Ms. Adams is also a member of the Climate Power 2020 Michigan State Advisory Committee and the inaugural chair of the Shelby County Lead Prevention and Sustainability Commission. In addition to her work in environmental justice, Ms. Adams has spent over a decade serving as an educator in both the classroom and district level. She is currently the Director of Organizational Quality in the Shelby County Office of Charter Schools in Tennessee and the founder of the Memphis Restorative Justice Coalition. Ms. Adams has been recognized as the Greater Washington Urban League Volunteer of the Year and National Urban League Voting Professionals Distinguished Member. She has received the inaugural Memphis Urban League Young Professionals Rockstar Award, named in her honor in 2018, and was the recipient of the 2018 Unbossed and Unapologetic Visionary Award at the inaugural Black Millennial Political Convention. What an honor it is to welcome LaTricea Adams. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Phil, for that warm and just phenomenal introduction. It's always so strange to hear your bio, but I am very excited to be here with everyone virtually in this space. But before I begin, I just want to honor the ancestors that paved the way for me to stand within their space and walk in their footsteps. I want to lift up this morning a beloved ancestor who is often thought of as the mother of the environmental justice movement, Hazel Johnson, which hailed from the great city of Chicago. And along with honoring our ancestors, I'd also like to uplift our elders. I would be remiss to go into this conversation without acknowledging the father of the environmental justice movement, the Dr. Robert Bullard. While this is also National Lead Prevention Week, we also need to take time to think about there's another celebration that we have this week that actually began the infrastructure that we know as environmental justice, fighting for issues that are pervasive in our communities, such as lead exposure and lead poisoning. This week actually marks 30 years of the 17 principles of environmental justice. And what makes that so important is that the very work that we are convening on this morning and throughout our day-to-day creating lead-free communities should be grounded in those 17 principles. 30 years ago in Washington, D.C., the first delegation and convening of people of color with the Environmental Summit took place. And on the last day of that convening is when the 17 principles of environmental justice were born. And so since then, 30 years plus, even those years before, we have been fighting for our dignity with having access to healthy, clean, and green communities. So I thank you again. I thank you to my ancestors and the elders for instilling in me all that's necessary to carry this torch forward to ensure that we are unrelentingly advocating and fighting for environmental justice in our communities. And with that, I'd like to transition to a presentation. So this keynote is going to be a little bit different. As you heard, I am an educator by trade, so I want to make sure that when we walk away from this phenomenal event, that we have some gems and some nuggets to really inform the work that we're already doing. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, grounding our work this morning in the 17 principles of environmental justice. And so I would say to everyone who is listening this morning that as you navigate through your work, that you familiarize yourself with all 17 principles, but also think about, out of all of these principles, what is it that gets you up in the morning? What is it that resonates with you, that feeds into your passion to ensure that we provide lead-free communities, housing, just environments that are lead-free for our families, and especially our most precious gifts, our children, to thrive. So today, if you don't do anything else, make sure that you refresh your memory or become introduced to the concepts of the 17 principles of environmental justice. Next slide. So a key point before we start to unpack the issues that are pervasive in our communities around lead, it's important for us to understand the difference between environmental justice and what appears to be a very trending topic now, which is going green. And the best way that I found to help to conceptualize that is when we think about environmental justice, we're keeping people at the center. Okay, so when we talk about environmental justice, it by definition is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. Operative word, all people. We have to look at this work from an intersectional perspective. So this is regardless of race, of color, ethnicity, origin, income. And also thinking about how this can be more of a democratic process as we think about how we can rid our communities of environmental toxins. That means that throughout that process, that there has to be a collaboration that is inclusive of those people who live in frontline communities as we think about the implementation, the development, and the enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And it's imperative that those people who are directly impacted are engaged on the front end. How often do we, especially people of color, see where there have been policies, legislation that has already been drafted, and then you get sent the information on the back end asking, can you make comment on this? Just that practice alone is not representative of environmental justice. It behooves us as leaders in our community that we are inclusive from the front end as it relates to truly representing environmental justice in practice. Now, thinking about the concept of going green. Now, this is by no means to, and I'm going to sound like a Southerner, to shade the going green movement. It is important and it does serve a very vital purpose in this work. But again, it's imperative to keep people and humanity at the center. So when we hear these buzzwords around green going green, it means to pursue knowledge and practices that can lead to more environmentally friendly and conscious practices and lifestyles, but it's still not centered and grounded in humanity. We also have to look at environment as how us as human beings are reacting to the ever-changing concepts that take place within the environment. And so we have to move beyond just an idea and a concept. We have to move into action, which will truly revolutionize the communities that we serve. Let's go to the next slide. So another hard pill to swallow is, as we begin to talk about lead poisoning, we have to understand and acknowledge environmental racism. So just as we amplify and advocate for environmental justice, we have to know that the core of their work is dismantling environmental racism. It is quite a shame as we look at this statistic that at all income levels, okay, so no matter how much coin you have secured, at all income levels, Black children are 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from lead poisoning in the US than white children. So in order to enter into this work with the correct infrastructure and the correct lens, we have to understand what we're up against. We are all up against white supremacy. And in order for us to dismantle it, it will take all of us in unity to acknowledge the instances of environmental racism. Again, let's look at that statistic again. Regardless of income level, we talk often about underserved communities, underprivileged communities from an economic perspective, but regardless of how much wealth a Black family has, your children, our children, children that look like me, are 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from lead poisoning. That is a problem that is definitely worth talking about, but most importantly, working for. Let's go to the next slide. Taking a look at these two beautiful people, this Black queen and this Black king, moving from my left to the right, this first beautiful young lady is Corinne Gaines. Right next to this picture of Corinne Gaines is Freddie Gray. These two individuals are very important to lift up this morning as we have a conversation about lead poisoning. Both of these individuals experienced childhood lead poisoning. As we know, with any exposure to lead is unsafe. But when you get to levels of poisoning, you start to see issues such as cognitive issues. You start to see issues with mental health and behavioral issues, both of which these two individuals experienced throughout their lifetime. Now, what is even more devastating is these two vibrant Black lives were taken by law enforcement. These are instances that could have been prevented. One of the key things that we have to know about lead poisoning is the life cycle of how lead poisoning impacts you over time. The concept of body burden and how accumulating lead within the body over time can impact you mentally, physically. Even thinking about Corinne Gaines in this first picture, with lead poisoning having somewhat of an impact on her reproductive health. It's important that we look at all social determinants of health as it relates to lead poisoning. Looking at this graph that is adjacent to the photo of Freddie Gray, there is research that tells us, and these numbers do not lie, as you overlap and begin to establish a relationship between the existence of lead poison in communities and the occurrences of violence in communities, there is a connection between the two. So when we talk about some of the societal ills that exist within our communities, when we talk about health disparities, when we talk about in the absorbent amount of crime that may exist in our communities that are hit the hardest, how often are we thinking about how environmental justice issues or injustice issues such as lead poisoning may be causing some of these very undesirable actions and impacts within our communities? It's important that when we think about community organizing, when we think about advocacy, it's imperative that we think about how lead poisoning truly is poisoning not just people in the community, but the community at large. Let's go to the next slide. So we talk about lead poisoning today. Oftentimes in this work, we spend a lot of time talking about how lead is pervasive in water, of course, in housing and soil. We don't spend a lot of time talking about how lead shows up in consumer products. And so when we talk about consumer products, we're talking about, in some instances, imported items such as toys that are oftentimes very cheap toys. Couldn't think of a euphemism there. Also, beauty products in some instances have traces of lead, and ceramics. Now, when we think about and visualize all of these little types of items, they're often found in places like dollar stores or super value stores. Now, close your eyes for just a few seconds and picture where you see dollar stores like Dollar Tree and the like. They are most frequently found in impoverished and majority Black and Brown communities. So we already are experiencing issues with lead entering to our drinking water, lead-based paint issues with lead dust in the home, even thinking about the implications of climate and how we see lead being in soil. We think about the gentrification that occurs within our cities. I think about in Memphis and Washington, D.C., for example, where you start to see development on property that used to be public housing, or what we call projects, that were full of lead. And so that lead has a place to go, and oftentimes it goes into the soil. So when we think about lead poisoning, we have to think about it in totality and the ways in which we have to work as a collective to ensure that we are creating barriers to block lead from exposing folks in our respective communities. All right, let's go to the next slide. So a good segue to talk about climate. Now, we have heard this word more than ever. It became front and center in the 2020 presidential election. It had not been a topic or even a question about climate since the early 90s. So it was very important to hear and consistently hear about the work being done to address climate. But we can't forget about lead poisoning and how lead exposure still has a connection to climate. So as we start to see climate change occur all across the country with intense storms that are occurring in places that are not even equipped with the infrastructure to sustain such extreme weather, the amount of flooding that takes place, the impacts on Superfund sites. Now, I know in the great state of Pennsylvania, you all know far too well the instances and occurrences are too frequent with Superfund sites as well as brownfields, and how that still has an impact on how we are exposed to lead in our community. And most devastatingly, the impacts that it has on health from a public health perspective is also really important to think about how lead poisoning is pervading into our bodies and our communities in a myriad of ways. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so I would like to end today on a higher note. So I want to talk through just some lessons from the field that I have experienced and observed through my work with Black Millennials for Flint, of course, that have influenced some of the work that I have had an opportunity and honor to engage with as being a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council member. So there are 4 lessons that I want to speak to briefly. The first first one is around the first bill that Black Millennials for Flint was able to get passed in the District of Columbia, which we endearly call DC, our nation's capital. And then we'll talk about work that we have done from a community-centered perspective in Flint, Michigan, at the intersection of Black maternal health and environmental justice and lead poisoning, because they are all related. And then talking about community-driven empowerment that's taking place currently in Shelby County, which is also Memphis, Tennessee, going to speak to the Lead Prevention and Sustainability Commission, and then leading to Baltimore, talking about community-based accountability. If we can go to the next slide. So in Washington, D.C., interestingly enough, if you look at this timeline, Black Millennials for Flint was actually started in February of 2016. And I am an educator by trade. I'm not an environmental scientist. I am just a person who cares deeply and truly about my community. And so with the DC Childhood Lead Prevention Amendment Act, we actually took a trip to Flint, Michigan, where we were reacting like many people did at the time, where we were hosting several water giveaways to ensure that there were immediate resources provided to the Flint community. During that particular time, we also took along with us youth from Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, after that first trip that we took to Flint, Michigan, when our children returned back to school, they received notices in the mail that they had elevated lead levels in their school drinking water. And so that was a wake-up call for me, for the founders of Black Millennials for Flint, while we will always maintain Flint in our namesake, because Flint had some unyielding, unbreakable organizers who made sure that the world, not just the United States, learned about environmental racism and how it can truly devastate a small city, but not just in Flint, but across the country, even in our nation's capital. So as you can see here, it was a grand journey to get this act passed. It was this bill passed. It was very community centered. And it all started from just parents demanding that there are answers around, why am I sending my child to school where there's no safe drinking water? And so in July of 2017, with the unanimous vote and a lot of work behind the scenes, we were able to get that bill passed. Let's go to the next slide. So to go into greater depth, and this is a really good strategy just from a political advocacy perspective, it's really important when you try to get community members engaged in policy. I know, especially working with younger people, millennials and Gen Z, oftentimes you hear, I don't like politics. Right? I don't like to work with politicians. Well, guess what? If you want to get bills passed, if you want to get things resourced, you have to make friends, or at least inform folks around what it is that you desire and need for your respective community. And so with this particular bill, we did a pretty in-depth analysis of the work that we did and how it showed up in this bill. Let's go to the next slide. So in this bill, we made some significant legislative recommendations. And so we broke that down. The reason why we implemented this visualization is we wanted to demonstrate to the community members that we work with and serve how their recommendations showed up into this legislation, but then also equipping them with ways to make sure that when this bill passed, that they are assessing that the bill is being implemented with fidelity. And so as we can see here, several of our recommendations show up in the bill. So one of it was around making sure that there was swift turnaround time with remediation. So we can't wait a full calendar year for a water source to be replaced or filters at the site. We need for that to happen right away. We also look at the intersectionality of how environmental justice shows up with language accessibility. So in communities in Washington, D.C., and many areas that we see across the country, everyone's first language is not English. And so we wanted to make sure that there was inclusion of the language accessibility law to ensure that as information is distributed to parents and families, that it was accessible regardless of what the first language may be. We can go to the next slide. So I'd also like to pinpoint some other key items that showed up in the bill. So because we had such a diverse set of people that we engaged in the community, you can see that from the diversity of the recommendations. And so we see here that we focus on making sure that there is signage at the site of water sources that have received filters, that there are updates provided and posted around when these water sources or these filters were actually replaced. Again, making that clear delineation between not just getting a bill passed, but making sure there's language in that bill to ensure that there is fidelity and implementation. And so we can go to the next slide. Now, interestingly enough, while we saw many check marks with some of our recommendations, if you're not familiar with Gallaudet University and also some other schools in the area that are very accessible to those who are both hearing and visually impaired. On the visually impaired side, we didn't actually get this language included in the bill. Now, that is something that we still continue to advocate for, but I still think that even bringing that to the forefront as something to think about and to consideration is very necessary. So we can go to the next slide. So out of all of those recommendations, 8 out of the 9 actually showed up in this bill. So about 89% of these community-driven, operative words, they're community-driven recommendations showed up in this bill. That is a celebration and a wonderful way to use data in a way that really encourages and inspires community members like, look what we have achieved together. So we didn't wait on folks that are already elected to tell us what the bill was going to be. It was from the community up. So we informed our elected officials about what we desired to show up in that bill. Let's go to the next slide. So in Flint, Michigan, if you have been following this tragic story that's still not over, that we see mirrored in many different cities across the country, there was a huge impact of the Flint water crisis as it relates to reproductive health. So many childbearing people in the city of Flint experienced premature births, unfortunately miscarriages and the like, due to toxicity of lead due to the Flint water crisis. And so we have had a long-standing partner with a faith-based leaders in the Flint community, particularly a church that has now established what is called Revive Community Health Center. And so we're partnering together to do several things. One, to amplify the importance of Black doulas and other ancestral birth workers, as we know that Black maternal health is something that we also struggle with that intersects with environment. We also, with the support of Sister Song, established a program called Lead-Free Mamas, where we work with Black and Brown doulas and other birth workers to educate them on how environment intersects at maternal health and reproductive health. And so with that, this education model informs both wraparound services and case management to best serve childbirthing people in the Flint community. We can go to the next slide. And so taking it down to Tennessee and Memphis, Tennessee, the county in Memphis is called Shelby County. Now, another community-focused entity, and you'll see that that is pretty much a trend in the work that I do and the work that we do with Black Millennials for Flint. We established what's called the Lead Prevention and Sustainability Commission. And so this particular community-driven entity in the county was established in partnership with the mayor of Shelby County, a dynamic Black brother, Morehouse man, who initially served as a state senator in the state of Tennessee. And while he was state senator, he introduced the bill in what is a very conservative state, making it mandatory for testing of lead in school drinking water. And so we were just amazed to see that a bill that is somewhat similar to what we got passed in DC was something that was also getting its footing in the state of Tennessee. And so still going within that trend of making sure that there's community oversight and ensuring that bills are implemented with fidelity is what got us to this point with the establishment of this commission. And just a few of the milestones with this community-based initiative. And again, this is a very young entity. It's barely 2 years old, but to date, we were able to serve as the community liaison, establishing a EPA environmental justice grant between the Shelby County Health Department and other community-based organizations where we prioritize Black and Brown environment organizations on the ground in Memphis. And then also we advocated to add additional amendments to the bill to be inclusive of childcare facilities in the original bill. In addition to that, we expanded some of the focus area, not just on lead, how it shows up in schools, but also in the community at large, and also the impacts of Superfund sites, which are in so many places concentrated in Black and Brown communities in Shelby County, how that impacts our infrastructure, both from housing as well as water quality. We can go to the next slide. And so last but certainly not least, Black Millennials for Flint had an opportunity to be featured on BET in a docuseries that featured now the late, great Michael K. Williams, where we were captured doing work that we love doing, which is canvassing. And we focused on tenants' rights, where we went door to door. As you can see here, we visited over 60 properties where we essentially educated those individuals on their tenants' rights as they lived in homes, residential areas that had lead paint violations. And so again, in the same vein with community accountability, we did an assessment, an accountability assessment to see, based on those properties that we visited, how many of those properties actually had those lead issues remediated. And unfortunately, to date, absolutely none of those properties within a 2-year span have actually been remediated. And so it's imperative, again, when we think about policy, we have to think about practice and what accountability looks like. And so now, since we have this data, we're able to advocate from a very specific perspective to elected officials. We can better educate community members to ensure that their rights are not being violated. Right? And I think that we're coming to my last slide as I begin to close. All right. So the key takeaways from this unconventional keynote is I don't want to belabor you with just information about what the issues are around lead. We know the irreversible damage that exists with lead within our communities, but the focus for this work should be around the work and what we can do to improve our advocacy. So one of the key things that we need, and this is from the concept of Ujima, a Swahili word which we hear a lot during Kwanzaa around collective work and responsibility. We need public health experts to support us in this work and medical professionals. So one of the things that helped us to get the bill passed in DC was we had people who were pediatricians that came to back us. So it's not just the environmental based organizations, but it takes all of our talent, all of our treasure to truly get to lead-free communities. If you actually don't know how to insert into the work, partner with organizations like Black Millennials for Flint to help us to mobilize in community, to create and establish lead-free communities. And the last thing that I'll say before I close today actually comes from the late, great Congressman John Lewis. I had an opportunity to meet him in January 2018. And one of the things that he said that will stick with me for the rest of my life is to humanize the work. So let's not get caught up in data and spreadsheets around how lead is impacting our communities, because it's very easy to stick to statistics. Picture the actual individuals that are being impacted by this work and allow that to move you and to keep you motivated and inspired to move full force ahead to ensure that we are fighting unrelentlessly together towards lead-free communities. And with that, thank you so much for giving me this platform to share some of my experiences, successes, and the road ahead that we must all travel together for a lead-free USA. Thank you so much.
Thank you, LaTricea. This information that you provided was so helpful. Thank you for the work that you are doing. This is amazing. Everything that you talked about kicks us off for today's long list of sessions that we will be holding. So please stay tuned. Please stick around because we will be going into more details of the topics, many of the topics that you discussed. So thank you for that.